Good morning to Brenton. 18 months after our last conversation about business development within the law profession. And we're going to give you an update with obviously regards to the fact that the last 18 months has seen quite a lot of change, or not, as the case may be. So another welcome to Brenton, who, for those of you who don't know, is the Marketing and Business Development Director at Dentons here in Australia. So good morning.
Thanks, Alistair.
Good morning and happy Friday to you.
Thank you.
So I think the phrase is, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Any observations there post-COVID?
Well, look, I think that's spot on, Alistair. I think what we saw last year was what firms and individuals ended up reaping last year was what they'd sowed in the years before that. We often talk about there being no silver bullets with BD, and I think nothing changed last year in terms of that. We saw some of the tools that we use to reach clients disappear, some of the entertainment options, some of the conferences, some of the face-to-face meetings that we would usually have disappear. But what we didn't see was a fundamental change in the way we go about business development. Those fundamentals haven't changed at all. And as I say, what we experienced last year was really what we'd done in those previous years of 2018 and 2019. And very much what we're going to experience this year is going to be a feature of what we did in 2020. So really the key has been consistent business development through that time, in the lead up to COVID, through COVID and post-COVID. And I think what the smart professionals have been doing is keeping their finger on business development through that time and keeping up those level of activities.
So can you perhaps talk to what types of activities that might involve? Perhaps if we start with existing clients, what might have been going on in that sphere?
Yeah, look, I think come back to the fundamental, to develop a client relationship, to build a client relationship, there's two basic things that you need. You need a frequency of contact with that client, and you need to be delivering value. If either of those things don't exist in your client relationship, then you're not going to get very far with it. So let's talk about frequency. You need to have a level of frequency of contact with that client that is relevant to the client that you're targeting, the client that you have. Now, that frequency is going to differ based on the situation that you're in with the client, the level of relationship that you already have with that client. So it's really important to understand, how often do I need to be in touch with this client? How often do I need to be reaching out to them? The second point is value. You need to be delivering value to your clients. And this, I think, is one thing that did change over the course of 2020. Value has been becoming increasingly more important for the last 5 years, 10 years. The days of just catching up with someone, having a cup of coffee are long gone. You need to be delivering ideas, insights, opportunities, identifying risk and articulating how clients can mitigate that risk to be able to actually add value to your client. If you're not adding value, you're going to find your access is restricted. Now, when you can get that balance between frequency and value right, that's when you're going to start to see development in that client relationship. So that's the first sort of fundamental that you need to be thinking about. Now, when we think about, well, how do we actually deliver that value? Again, we saw some change there in 2020. The coffee meeting has disappeared. The round table has disappeared. The lunch has disappeared. So we've had to work differently and work harder to enable us to get that access so that we can maintain that frequency. So we've seen a lot of things like, webinars. We've seen webinars really rise to prominence. And I think there's good ways and there's better ways to do webinars. And what I noticed over the course of last year, early on, we saw really large webinars being offered that were largely general in nature. But as the year wore on, I think we started to see those webinars get a little bit more targeted, smaller audiences and much more specific topics, so that those topics spoke to that specific audience. And again, we've always sort of talked about the need to make sure that it's not just something that you deliver and then hope that the phone rings. You need to be thinking about, well, what's our next step? How do we follow up with clients once we've delivered a webinar? And it's much easier to do that when you're using a really targeted approach, targeted in terms of the topic and targeted in terms of the audience that you're trying to reach.
Sage advice. And would that be hugely different if you were looking to engage prospects or build a relationship with a potential prospect?
I think it's harder, in my view, to build a relationship with a prospect over a webinar. It's much harder to build any sort of personal relationship. I think what you find is that you have people turn up to your webinars. They might get some value out of that webinar, but it's much harder to turn that into a client if you're prospecting. I think you have to work harder in that sense to actually solidify that relationship. Now, it's not to say we can't try to do that. It's not to say that it's impossible to do that, but we need to work much harder. And one of the features that's come out in a lot of the research around business development and client relationships over the course of last year is that clients turned to their trusted advisors. They turned to those advisors that they knew, that they thought they could rely on, that were committed to the relationship. So in that environment, firstly, it's really important to focus on those relationships and protect those relationships that you have. But equally important, if you're going to try and increase your client base, and I always advocate we should be doing that, new client, new business is always an important part of the business development mix. You've really got to focus on it and work hard to do that. To do that, you can't be targeting everyone. You've got to have a really small target list that you're trying to build and really focus in on that and just try and develop those few relationships.
Sure. And how have you kept relationships going along with referrers, for example? Referrers is sometimes, I think, an area that's dropped off when people have said we can't do random acts of coffee and lunch anymore. I think the referral relationships are perhaps an area that's struggled.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think people get very comfortable with those random coffees. And look, I enjoy them as well. Like it's very beneficial to sit in front of someone and have a conversation for 30 or 40 minutes. And it's amazing where that conversation goes. But we all found ourselves in exactly the same situation at exactly the same time. And what didn't disappear was the telephone. What didn't disappear was this technology we're using at the moment. There are plenty of ways to still maintain those relationships. And often it's just these sort of conversations where, there's not necessarily an objective, but there's an understanding that let's explore where opportunities might be. It's really important to keep those conversations up. And I think with referral networks, it's really easy to do that because generally referral networks work both ways. It's not the same as let's say a professional client relationship where, often the fees are moving in one direction. With a referral relationship, the fees can move in both directions. And the more we're talking with our referrers, the more we're able to sort of explore and understand where opportunities might be. So my key message there is you really just need to keep up that conversation.
One of the interesting things for me was people who were previously saying that they had no time to do content marketing all of a sudden found that they weren't commuting to the office, so they were probably saving 2 hours a day on the commute. And then if they didn't have as much billable hours to do, that excuse went away. Did you see people actually committing to doing more of this content marketing type of work? And if they were, what types of things were they spending the time on?
I think very early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of content floating around. And yeah, I'm not sure whether it was because people had more time or whether they just prioritized it greater. I mean, I've always sort of believed that you prioritize the things that are important. So, if you genuinely thought that creating content, creating thought leadership, creating ideas and pushing them out to your clients was important, you would have found the time to do that anyway. That said, there certainly was more content that came out. Problem that I saw with a lot of that content was that it was very general in nature. And that's not the way the market has gone over the past 5 years or so. What we've seen is increasingly a greater level of personalization in that content. And there were some great articles, probably around April, May last year, that quoted general counsels essentially saying, hey, professionals, stop sending me all of this content. It's not helpful. I can't wade through it. I don't know what to do with it. And so essentially, a lot of firms just ended up spamming a lot of clients. And what I think the approach really needs to be is much more content personalization. So sure, let's write an article about, what the employment impacts of COVID are. But before we send that to a client, let's think about what are the impacts on that individual client. What do we want that client to think, feel, or do differently having read that article? And that's where I think the great opportunity is for professional services firms. Thinking about how do we personalize this content? And often firms want to find a technology solution to this. We need a better CRM system that will allow us to target our content at the clients that are going to need it. And I think that's really important. And there's some fantastic CRM systems out in the market that allow firms to do that. But I think that approach in itself forgets a really important element. And we often talk about AI being the technology that allows us to target those clients with the right content. The other side of that is HI, which is human intelligence. And human intelligence is really about putting a lens over that and saying, what is the impact for this client? Why does the client want to hear about this from me? And what is the client going to get out of it? And that's, as professionals, that's where we truly add our value. If we skip that step, I think that there's a really important piece of value that is missing. And ultimately, it doesn't have the same impact with the client.
Some of the research I've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks has strongly suggested that more and more leads and instructions have come through digital channels, almost 40% in some cases. Have you seen much change in that yourself, or how important those digital channels have become, or have you seen any new pieces of software or toys, or have you taken on new devices like Loom videos to reach out to people? There's a whole host of new technologies available to people.
Yeah, look, on the technology side, not necessarily my area of expertise in terms of how we get that content out there. What I would say in relation to that is we really need to be thinking about the content that we are trying to get out there. And content is king when it comes to digital channels. I mean, ultimately, that is how we reach our clients. The channels that we reach them through, they're important, but the channels don't matter if you don't have that content. So I guess I come back to my earlier point there that getting that content right and getting it personalized is really important. I often see a lot of professionals dismiss digital channels, particularly things like social media. And look, I think social media needs to be considered as a channel to get to market. It's never going to be the channel. I don't think we'll ever find ourselves in a position where social media or digital is the only way that we're engaging with clients, and that is really the avenue of revenue into the firm. But it's certainly a contributor to the mix. And I think professionals who don't engage at a social media level, and we're talking professional social media, not personal social media, they're missing a channel to market.
And I'm sure you would agree that all technologies or social medias are there only to deliver the strategy. It's not a strategy in itself. So again, I've spoken to many a firm over the recent months who said, oh, well, social media is an area we haven't really engaged with and we feel like now is the time to do it. But it wasn't part of a strategy or to deliver a particular message to a certain type of client. It was just something they felt they needed to start doing, which is always dangerous because the technology should be there to help deliver the strategy, but you need the strategy first.
Oh, look, absolutely. Social media will never be the solution in itself. It is a way to market. The same way hosting a round table is a way to market. The same way hosting a webinar is a way to market, or having a coffee with a client is a way to market. It's part of the mix. I think it's a really dangerous position if organisations do social media just because they feel they need to do social media. As you say, it's got to be part of the overall strategy and a tool to execute on that strategy.
So in terms of cultural change and people onboarding new skills, perhaps who, maybe more senior members of the team might have had to have been introduced to some more, the ideas of doing webinars or video or any of these tools that we now take for granted that perhaps weren't around or weren't in daily use 12 months ago. Has there been any challenges around onboarding, some of the partners to get on board with these new skills and toys?
I think everyone's adapted to it pretty well and pretty quickly. What I'm seeing now, though, is the the time of clunkiness on a webinar is gone. Everyone expects that a webinar is going to be delivered in an efficient and professional way. I do see a lot of professionals still delivering webinars as if they're just sitting at their desk. They don't have good lighting. They might not have good sound. They're sitting down while they're delivering, a 45-minute presentation. What I'd encourage all of those professionals to think about is, wind your memory back 12 months. Would you ever deliver to a live audience sitting down looking at your screen? You simply wouldn't. So I think it's really important that professionals evolve the way that they're presenting. Ultimately, the way that you're presenting has an impact on your brand. It is a tangible delivery of the brand promise that you have. So that delivery needs to look sharp, it needs to look professional, it needs to be sleek, and it needs to be efficient. And I think that there's an investment that firms need to make sure that the way that their professionals are delivering represents both their own brand and represents their firm brand.
Sure, and that's not, as we're talking with lights and sounds and microphones and so on, we know it's not a huge investment, but it does make a huge difference in terms of people's perceptions about quality and professionalism.
Absolutely, and it's it's a way to capture the audience, and hopefully the sound is good on this recording, and that's the reason I'm wearing these ridiculous headphones. If ultimately the sound is highly echoey and you can hear someone drilling in the background and the lawnmower's going, look, I'm not going to sit through a session where there's that background noise happening and I can barely see the presenter. And I think that's the case for most people. At the end of the day, it needs to be something that grabs the audience's attention, but also keeps the audience's attention.
So how do you see the future for things like events and entertainment? It's quite an interesting one because people have said to me, we're cutting back budgets. And I go, well, let's see where you can make the savings. So all the research I've done is around brand advertising, sponsorships, and corporate entertainment are three areas that you can really look to make reductions in costs. And a lot of the routes to market and things we're talking about actually don't cost any money to implement. So that's a good thing. And I, clearly I have a passion for training and development to upskill people at some of these new skills and so on. So two questions here really. One, what do you see for the future of events and entertainment in the short term or longer? And how do you see the delivery of training and so on moving forward?
Okay, let's take the events and entertainment point first. Look, I think we will see events come back, but I think we will see them come back in a different way. I think large events are probably going to be a thing of the past for the most part. I think what we will see is smaller events, targeted events, lunches, roundtables, perhaps small CLEs. I don't think we'll see the large events at conference centres and so forth. And I think in part that is going to be because it's going to take some time before people are going to be comfortable in those environments again. But also I think what the pandemic has done is given a lot of professional services firms pause for thought around how they spend their money. And a lot of firms just simply weren't able to spend the money in the way that they had spent the money for the previous 5, 10, however many years it was. And I think that pause for thought has actually raised the thought that maybe we don't need to spend that. And when firms have been able to maintain their revenues without doing those large scale events, I think it really does raise the question of, did we need to do that at all? I think a lot of times we see events happen because they happened last year and people had a good experience with them. And I'm not just talking entertainment events, I'm talking, major conferences as an example. So I don't think that we will see those particularly in the short term. Longer term, they may start to come back as I say, as people get more comfortable and as budgets open up. But I actually think that it's a good thing that a lot of these larger spends have been raised into question, because I don't know that there's always been a great ROI on a lot of large entertainment events. And so I think that money is then going to be able to be repurposed into other things, such as hosting smaller events, such as business development, training, etc. So I think that's a really positive step for us. The The other point you raised was around training, I think, Alistair. Sorry?
Training, upskilling, coaching of individuals.
Yeah, so look, I think that's where I'd encourage firms to spend their money. There's really always opportunity to increase the skill level that we have within our professionals. We know that our professionals are not trained in this. A lot of them have sort of picked these skills up as they've gone through their career, and some of them are very, very good at it. But there's others where there's the opportunity to learn more. And I think that's where the opportunity is at the moment, to really increase those skills, because ultimately that's what is going to generate the revenue for the firm. I've always been a believer that if you're relying on entertainment and events to generate revenue for your firm, that's a really short-term strategy, because all it's going to take is someone with deeper pockets, with access to better tickets, whatever it might be, that can come and sweep that client away from you. If that's all you've got to rely on, what we need is professionals that have really high technical skills around business development, that have different ways of embedding those relationships with clients.
Sure. And where do you sit on, one of the frustrations I have as a provider of those types of things is when I go to a firm and they say, oh, well, we just want you to work with the next generation. The partners get it. They're good at this. And I kind of think, I'm not sure that's it's true. And or worse, people will say, here's 10 partners who are underperforming. Can you help with these guys? And I kind of go, well, I can, but with the best will in the world, I'll train them to be average, and then you'll have an average organization at best. Whereas if you actually train and motivate and work with the people who are already good and make them outstanding, that's how you get your firm to grow exponentially, because you get the best people to grow even more. Do you have a view around that?
Yeah, I've always worked on the 20-60-20 principle, which essentially says 20% of the people within any organization you don't need to work with, because they already get it. They know how to do this. There's very little that you can teach them. It's going to be incremental improvement that you get. At the other end of the scale, you have 20% that just are not interested in this, are not going to be receptive to training, don't want to change the skill set that they have. And really, it's a trap to spend time there, because you just end up spinning your wheels. The 60% in the middle is where the opportunity is. So these are people that are open to training, open to increasing their skills, want to increase their skills, are motivated around that, and you have the opportunity to influence them. That's where the greatest benefit for any organization is going to come from. Now, the challenge is actually identifying that 60%. And often what you find is the bottom 20% say that they want it, but then are resistant to it when you're trying to deliver it. I always come back to an article that was shared with me many years ago now, and it's actually from the early 90s. And the title of that article is Teaching Smart People How to Learn. I think Chris Argus, maybe saying his surname wrong there, is the author. But really what that article is about is really how you train senior professionals. And senior professionals are very good largely at one thing, whether it's law, whether it's accounting, whether it's consulting. They're very good at that one thing, and they really have trouble learning other skills outside of that. And this article, really sort of sets out a pathway of how you can help bring those people around. Now, with those sort of people, what I always advocate is a one-on-one approach. I've never found those sort of people learn well in a classroom environment. I always get more out of those people when I can sit down with them one-on-one, really sort of understand what their issues are, build a relationship with them over a period of time, get to understand where their fears, their anxieties, their nervousness is around that, and try and work with that. And also find where their level of comfort is. What aspects of the BD mix are they actually comfortable doing? Let's focus on those. There's no point trying to get someone to, let's say host round tables when what they're really comfortable in is, producing content. Let's focus on the producing content and how can we maximize the value of that. Your point around the next generation, I think, is a good one. We absolutely need to focus on the next generation, and there's a lot of ability to influence at that next generation. What we need to help that is really good role models within an organization that we can point to and say, these are the sort of behaviors that you want to be modeling. when you're developing your BD approaches.
Sure. So I'm conscious of time. Is there anything, if I was to say, for people listening on here, if they were to pick 2 or 3 things perhaps to focus on in, the upcoming 6 months between now and the end of the financial year here at Down Under, what type of things do you think where they would get most ROI or quick ROI?
I think let's talk about cross-sell for a minute, Alistair. Cross-sell is a great topic that always comes up in organisations. People will quote the statistics to you. It's, I don't know, pick the number, 7 times easier to sell to an existing client than a new client. All of those statistics, are broadly right. Where I think professionals and organisations go wrong in that is not looking at that cross-sell from the client's perspective. So, we want to sell more of our services to an existing client. Let's go down there and introduce them to a partner in the corporate area or a partner in the tax area. We really need to understand what is driving that client's business at the moment. What are the needs of that client's business? And then do we have the right people with the right level of expertise, with the right ideas and insights to actually go and have a conversation with that client? And there's really a critical moment there where you have to say, is now the right time? If now isn't the right time, if we don't have any great ideas, if there's nothing insightful that we can take, if we don't think that that's an area that the client's interested in at the moment, let's just pause on that. If we move on it now and try to create an introduction, we might just end up bruising that relationship. So again, I come back to the point of value. There's got to be a valuable reason for getting in touch with that client. And if we're going to cross-sell, let's make sure that we've got that reason. If not, let's just put the cue back in the rack. Might only be for 2 or 3 months while we develop that and while we get a bit of a better understanding of the client. The other thing I would say that I think really is going to have the greatest impact on an individual's ability to increase their relationships, just get in touch with your clients. I mean, I know it just sounds so obvious, but too often I see people make an excuse not to get in touch with the client. It's the new year. I'm sure they're busy. We're coming up to Easter. Everyone's going away. There's always a reason or an excuse that you can find not to contact a client. But I've never heard a client say, I really just wish they would go away. I wish you wouldn't contact me, unless we're missing that value point. So I think as long as you've got something interesting, insightful to say to a client, just pick up the phone. And I think generally, you'll be surprised at the response that you get.
So I've just got one last area to probe and question on, which is referrals. So referrals is a thing where everybody tells me that's how they grow their practice. It's word of mouth and this and so on. And then I tend to ask people, so how many referrals did you ask for last year? People go quiet and start looking at the shoes and so on. Do you have a feeling about, I'm a big believer that you need a trigger point for referrals. And part of that is client listening. If you do client satisfaction scores or these types of things, there's no better time to ask for a referral than when someone's just scored you 9 or 10 out of 10 on a feedback score. Do you have any sort of opinions around that?
I think you just sort of put my key point forward there, Alistair. Ask for the referral. One of the groups of professionals that I see this do really well are mortgage brokers. Mortgage brokers are always saying, look, if you enjoyed the service that I delivered you, you can pay me no greater compliment than to recommend me to someone who might be looking, to refinance, to take a new loan. I think often in the professions we're a little bit shy. We don't want to go to that step of asking, hey, is there anyone that you can refer me to? If there's anyone that that you think would benefit from working with me, that you think my personality would gel with, I'd really appreciate a referral. So I think, look, there's a limit to that. You don't want to be overly pushy with people, but I think most professionals have a strong enough sense of EQ to know when is the right time to ask for that. But I'd encourage people to just be a little bit more forward in asking for those referrals.
Awesome. I'm actually going to leave it there, Brenton. I think that's a great place to wrap it up. When we talk about value, we talk about connection with clients and referrals. All those things are so important and can be done in a COVID world. So on that note, I'm going to wish you well and we'll speak again soon. Thank you for your time this morning, Brenton.
Thanks, Alistair. Great to chat.
And to you. Thank you. Bye-bye now.